sexologist is just I don't know, I guess a scholarly term for deranged pervert. And, you know, anyone with the title of sexologist should be kept far away from children.
Stay away from my daughter.
And your family. You don't even want to touch them with a 6-foot pole.
Greetings to the brightest audience in creation. Welcome to Real Science Radio. I'm Doug McBurney.
And I'm Nicole McBurney. It's good to be on the air talking about real science on Friday.
That's right. It's Real Science Radio, and Fred Williams is on assignment this week, and so we're joined today by Real Science Radio contributing editor and producer Nicole McBurney with some analysis on one of the more important stories of the 21st century. And to set it up, I want to look back to the 20th century briefly because I remember listening to a radio talk show in 1994. The talk show host was G. Gordon Liddy, and he was warning his listeners that the subtle replacement of the word sex with gender was happening, and he noticed it because he's kind of a word geek. He noticed it, and he said, this is, first of all, it's grammatically incorrect. And second, he noted that this was not by accident. Now, Nicole, you don't remember this, but the early 1990s were the full court press of the homosexual rights movement, the first full court press, open, out there, everywhere. And G. Gordon Liddy noticed during this full court press to normalize perversion that the word sex was subtly and slowly being replaced in the media by the word gender. And he said it wasn't an accident, and he said there were nefarious motives behind it. And so now, fast forward 30 years, and we're in the midst of what some have dubbed the collapse of Western civilization into gender insanity. Help us understand.
Yeah, so gender insanity, I'd rather just call it insanity because calling it gender insanity would be adopting the terminology that you have just said is incorrect, or I guess as your radio talk show host had said. And I would completely agree with him that it wasn't by accident, and we'll get into the reasons why a little bit later on the show. I would just call it the ultimate manifestation of a century's worth of rebellion against God's design for family.
Wow. Well, that's putting quite a fine point on it. And now some people might think that talk of grammatical terms is going to be a dry and boring subject, but this is not dry and boring because this is an analysis of the corruption of our society. And we're going to start in the area of grammar, and then we're going to take it from there. Let's talk about the grammar a little bit. What have you found out?
Yeah, so the word gender originally, and I realize that, you know, if people ask me what my gender is, I'm not going to be confused by it because, and this is an argument that people give all the time, is, well, language changes, so, you know, deal with it. And I recognize that. But the term gender, when used as a noun, was originally a grammatical term for a category or a class that a noun falls into. And the word itself, the word gender, comes from the Latin word genus, which means kind, family, or order. So if you're familiar with taxonomy, you know scientists will classify an animal by their genus. And genus also comes from an even earlier word, or the Proto-Indo-European root gene, or gene, meaning to give birth or to beget. And this same root gives us our words generate, genetic, genealogy, or homogeneous, for example. I mentioned the PIE languages. Are you familiar with the PIE languages?
Well, PI, I'm familiar with pie, and I mean not just the kind you can eat. I'm familiar with 3.14.
All right.
So, am I in the ballpark?
No, not even close.
No.
But let me give you a third pie for you. This PIE is an acronym. It stands for Proto-Indo-European. And it's the Proto-Indo-European is a reconstructed language. It's not a real language. So you won't be able to go out into an archaeological dig and find a potsherd that says Arphaxad was here in the Proto-Indo-European language. But based off of how language has, I guess, evolved over time and distinguished itself into many other distinct languages, linguists can use these patterns and go backwards and reconstruct this mother language, this common ancestor. And this common ancestor encompasses languages all the way from the Indo-Iranian, like Bengali and Hindi, to the Greek and the Germanic and Italic languages. So all the way from India to Europe, you will find a common ancestor for these languages here. And that's a a broad area, which is pretty impressive.
Yeah, I wouldn't have thought Hindi was related to German, but apparently the linguists do.
Yeah, and so I had a graphic there of this family tree, and I'm putting up another graphic kind of showing you how these words could be related. Here's the word two, T-W-O, as in the number two. And if you compare it to many of these other PIE languages, you see like dos, duo, tu, trois. They're all very similar, and so linguists have linked this back to one word, dwoh, D-W-O-H, and that's what they guess the original language for this family would have looked like. So the number two all goes back to this one common word. And there are other words, not just the number two, but this is a really good example of that.
And so words can have a common ancestor, unlike proteins.
Yeah.
Which we learned from, when did we learn that on Real Science Radio recently in an interview with Sal Cordova on proteins.
Yes, we will link to that because that was a fantastic show. I recommend everybody go watch that. But languages do have a common ancestor, and I guess the earliest we can really go back is the Tower of Babel. And I think that's about when you could have pinned the Proto-Indo-European languages would have existed. So I had just, out of curiosity, Googled when the Proto-Indo-European languages, when linguists would have guessed that such a language would have existed. And they say probably around 2500 BC. And according to Answers in Genesis has estimated that the Tower of Babel was around 2200 BC. So about that time frame would have been whenever God split the languages, and Proto-Indo-European would have been one of those languages, it seems.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Interesting.
So, but going back to the word gender, the topic of today's show, when we look at the Webster's 1828 dictionary, we can see that this word was also used as a verb, and it means to beget or to breed, which is why in the King James, we should give a warning.
Warning, 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 Will Robinson. There are Bible verses up ahead. For those in the audience who advocate pluralism and diversity, we know here at Real Science Radio that you would censor anyone who would dare quote a Bible verse in public. So this warning gives you fair notice. Raw, unadulterated truth is about to be uttered.
That's right. So we go to Leviticus chapter 19, verse 19. It says, quote, "Thou shalt not let thy cattle gender with a diverse kind," unquote. And also in 2 Timothy 2:20, quote, "But foolish and unlearned questions avoid, knowing they do gender strifes," unquote. So we typically don't use the word gender as a verb today, but it was prevalent in the past. King James is evidence for that. But we mostly use it as a noun today. So that brings us back to gender as a case system in grammar.
Okay, now before we jump into gender as a case system, let me just see if I'm understanding here. So thou shalt not let thy cattle gender with a diverse kind. So in that phrase, gender has something to do with breeding.
Yep.
So one could say that it has something to do with sex in the breeding sense, but it doesn't have to do with sex in the male-female categorization sense. And then in the Apostle Paul's instruction to Timothy, he's saying avoid unlearned questions, knowing that they do gender strifes, meaning they cause strifes. They cause something to happen.
Yes.
So neither of those have to do with a male-female sex construct.
Right, not inherently. And, you know, as we get into this, like the case systems, like I was saying, so the Proto-Indo-European languages, I'm just going to start calling them the Pi languages because that's much easier to say. So a lot of the Pi-derived languages have a two-case system, masculine, feminine, or a three-case system, masculine, feminine, and neuter. But if you go outside of the Pi languages, you have Zulu, for example, which has 17 genders.
17?
17.
Oh, the Zulus must be popular over at the UN with 17 genders.
Right.
Boy.
Well, and this shows that gender is not distinctly male and female, or it doesn't have to be based off male and female as a category. And I'm putting up a chart here, and this is a category for people, not necessarily male and female, but you can see the word for boy, child, friend, parent, and person here all have a similar shape at the beginning. It all starts with So the word for boy is umfana, child umtwana, friend is umgane, parent umzali, and person umuntu. And for any of our Zulu speakers out there, I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong. I tried. But you can see there
we invite any Zulu speakers to call with corrections.
Yes, absolutely. But you can see my point is that they all have that first distinguishing that the noun here is talking about a person, and then the ending differentiates, it specifies what kind of person are we talking about. So that's how these nouns work in a gendered language. These are called inflections. The different shape is the inflection of the noun. And so...
And none of the 17 genders in the Zulu language have to do with male, female, gender fluid, gender unconcerned, gender inconsiderate, gender confused, or any of that stuff.
Yes, that whole thing came much later, long after Zulu was around. But then if we go back to the Pi languages, there are also some languages that don't have gender systems like Turkish, Persian, and English. English does have gender for the pronouns, and the reason is that's just leftover of the Old English system that used to be gendered for all of its nouns. So, like, if you're familiar with Spanish, you would know that there's masculine and feminine and neuter. So, like, la mesa, the table, is feminine. El tomate is masculine. The tomato is masculine in Spanish. But in English, we would just say the table, the tomato. We use the same article, and the ending doesn't really specify anything in our nouns. But we do, but in Old English, it used to be that we did have these masculine, feminine, and neuter genders, and we lost those between the 11th and 14th century as the language lost its inflection, and our sentence structure, English syntax, became much more rigid. So now we typically use a subject-verb-object order. So, like, I would say, I ate the soup. I could say the soup I ate, but that sounds weird, and it's maybe you might see that in poetry, but it's not really standard English. Maybe an uneducated person might say something like that. But that was fairly common in Old English. It wouldn't have sounded as weird because the different inflections in the noun would have been very clear what the subject and what the object was.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
And so in Old English, subject, verb, object was the most common word order, but you could switch them around. And in a highly inflected language like Greek, where the nouns have different endings and different articles depending on what part of speech they are, you can make a word salad and it still makes sense. It's not confusing, it doesn't sound weird. Whereas in English, you have to be very specific. You'd have to add more words to clarify what you mean.
So you could put together word salads and basically be a speechwriter for any number of candidates for higher office these days. And so this does indicate that with English, there has been a devolution of the language. The language has become less sophisticated and I would say a little more legalistic and a little more rigid, right?
Yeah, we've definitely lost, and this happens just because of various influences. Like I had mentioned earlier, people say language changes, and really the reason language changes is because of various influences, whether another country comes in, like William the Conqueror came in the 11th century, so we now have a lot of French loan words in our language, or cultural influences might have affected language changes. So all these various influences have caused us to lose our inflection and make our sentences more rigid. And now we generally have to use more words to describe what we mean. So I have this here. This is a book, Beowulf. And Beowulf is the English language's oldest epic. And I have it in parallel. So it has the Old English over here on this page and on the other page in Modern English. And if you just look at what I'm holding up, you can see that the Old English has, per line, fewer words than compared to the Modern English. And so, so where, a sentence might have 4 words in the Old English, you might need 10 words in the Modern English. So that just shows you over time. And I think that's also a reflection of general laziness in people. We start to break down, and so we need more information in order to pass on what we mean. Instead of using 1 or 2 words, now we need like 10.
Right. And it's sort of an algorithm that you can watch if you read the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. You can see that more words are required to describe situations because the situations just become more and more convoluted. At the very beginning, when God was in the garden with Adam and Eve, he could speak in very simple terms with them. But by the time it came to write the law down for the Jews, there's like 613 different laws that had to be. So I see a similar algorithm in the Bible and in language. Wow.
Yeah, so I kind of want to talk a little bit about the origin of gendered languages, because not all languages are gendered. Like Chinese, for example, has been around pretty much as far back as we can go, and it's not a gendered language. So it's not something that's necessary for language, and I think that's something that came out during the Tower of Babel. I have no other explanation. I think God's just creative, and he's just like, I'm going to do a little bit of this over here, and we're not going to do that over here. So that's why we have some languages that do and some languages that don't. So in English, whenever we think of gender, we tend to think male and female. And whereas in another language that is gendered, like maybe Spanish, growing up learning that language, you wouldn't really think of objects being male and female. They're just masculine and feminine, and that's just how the language is. And so whenever I study a language like Spanish, and they say, well, the genders are just kind of arbitrary. There's no reason for the table to be feminine in Spanish while the book is masculine. And that confused me because I'm thinking, how can you categorize something arbitrarily? Like, that just didn't make sense. And as I was studying this, I realized it's because I'm looking at it backwards. So let me kind of try and walk through this to help you understand where I'm coming from. So if we go back in time to the Sumerian languages, which linguists say is the oldest known language, and they did not have the masculine-feminine distinction, but rather a human-non-human distinction. And then later on, the Hittite language, which branched off the Proto-Indo-European early on, had an animate and non-animate. So kind of going from human to non-human, now you have like animate, meaning you could include animals and maybe some plants. So you're getting a little bit more specific. And then later on down the line, you get this from animate and non-animate. Now you have neuter, masculine, and feminine. And it's attributed to a man named Protagoras, who was a Greek philosopher and rhetorician. Linguists say he was the first to label nouns as masculine, feminine, and neuter. So I think up until this time, in history, peace is not very common. You're almost always fighting some battle or some blight, just trying to survive. So I don't think many people really had the time to sit down and analyze and categorize languages. But then in the 5th century BC, and we get this source from Aristotle, he says Protagoras was the one who kind of sat down and he was fascinated with grammar. And he's like, I see a pattern. We have these 3 categories, and I'm going to classify them as male, female, and neuter. And I think the reason he classified it as male, female, and neuter was because that's a concept anyone can grasp, right? Masculine, feminine, male, female, and neuter are three very distinct categories. At least we knew that up until modern times. And so, so he would look at these words and say, okay, the word for woman here has this ending and this article, and so do these words over here. All right, I'm going to classify those as the female nouns. And then he did the same for the male nouns, and then maybe whatever else was the neuter nouns. And there are some, exceptions to the rules, but generally speaking, words have a similar ending, and words that have a similar ending will have the same article. Like in English, we have a and the as articles. Greek has a lot more depending on what part of speech the noun is. So depending on masculine, feminine, or neuter, those articles would change. And so because he was kind of the first to categorize these, he noticed that some of these feminine nouns, such as menace, which means wrath and frenzy, or pelex, meaning helmet, he said these female nouns have the same ending as a lot of these masculine nouns. So we should stop using the female articles for these and categorize this as masculine. So I guess he was going through, and he's like, some of these aren't really matching up. So anyway, I just found that really interesting. And
so he had some influence on the structure of the language going forward after his analysis.
Yeah, it seems like, I'm not sure if they categorized it to his liking or not. And like I said, I'm not really familiar with Greek, but it was interesting. He noticed these patterns, and he's like, wait, these don't really fit. So going back to, I said it was confusing to me that the masculine, feminine, and neuter were arbitrary. And the reason I was thinking that is because I was thinking someone just sat down and decided this word's going to be masculine, this one's going to be feminine, and that one's neuter. But the language was already there. He was the one who just noticed the pattern and just categorized it by these masculine, feminine, neuter labels. He could have picked black, white, and gray. It didn't really matter what he called them. So in my English-speaking mind, I'm thinking backwards, thinking someone picked these, but that's just how language develops. So the arbitrariness comes into what words got what ending. That just kind of developed naturally. I don't know exactly what influences went in there. Maybe that was just the way God made it. That's the best I can say for that. So that's the aspect of gender and the linguistics. And if there's any linguists out there who want to correct me, because I'm not a linguist, I'm just a word nerd, please reach out and I will make corrections in the KGov over at rsr.org in the show notes. But now I want to get into the science of sex, male and female. But before we do that, I do need to ask you the interesting fact of the week.
Oh, that's right. The interesting fact of the week. We can't forget that. Everyone's on the edge of their seat.
That's right.
Lay it on me.
All right, so
let's hear it.
What do you call an animal with both male and female characteristics?
Animal with both male and female. David Bowie.
No.
No?
Not quite.
Okay, well, I have absolutely no idea what you would call that, but I'm sure you're going to tell me.
Yes, the answer is gynandromorph.
Gynandromorph. Okay, well, if I would have taken a little bit more time and gone through my rudimentary understanding of Latin and English, I probably could have come up, because it sounds like someone just mashed that word together.
Pretty much.
3 or 4 different
it might be
words.
pronounced gynandromorph, actually. I'm not totally sure. But gyno meaning woman, andro, man.
Andro,
so there you go.
Morph. I get it. I mean, it makes sense to me. I could see how that word evolved.
So
anyway, so there you have it.
There you go. And I got some pictures up showing you it's a butterfly, a lobster, and a couple birds. And these animals sometimes have something goes wrong in their genetics, and they have 50% male, 50% female, and the internal organs reflect that as well, not just the outside. But I do want to point out that this is an anomaly. This is not something that is normal.
Right. And so I also want to be clear that I don't want to imply that there was anything like that going on with David Bowie. That was
no. This
not he's without excuse for how strange he was. Anyway.
No. Yes.
Okay. So these anomalous Maybe you would even call them deformities?
Yeah, I would call them a deformity because it negatively impacts the organism. As far as I know, a gynandromorph cannot reproduce. And this is, and like I showed in the picture, a lobster, a butterfly, and a bird, it really only affects birds, insects, and crustaceans. It doesn't affect people. So some people will claim that there are intersex, but that's not what this is. That's not what a gynandromorph is. An intersex person is just someone who had something go wrong developmentally to where their sex is not very clear. But they're still one or the other. Just the physical development went wrong somewhere. And it's not just the reproductive organs that get affected. It's also typically like the joints are, misshapen, or you have weak ligaments, other physical problems to like organs. It's not just one aspect. It's bad for the entire body.
I see. And I remember, by the way, back during the full court press in the early 90s, when the normalization of sexual perversion was just full blown, if you spoke in the public square with the advocates of perversion, they would act like there was one of these intersex people around every corner. They were everywhere, and they were always a topic that they brought up in order to try to normalize what we always knew was abnormal and sad, by the way.
Yeah, like I said, this is it impacts people negatively who have this deformity. So sex, and let's just clarify, I'm talking about males and females, so we're getting into biology. It's a lot more cut and dry than the etymological origins of the word gender and gender categorizations and stuff. So explaining this will go by a lot quicker. But before we do that, a little bit of etymology. The word sex comes from the Pi root, the Proto-Indo-European root sek, S-E-K, meaning to cut, which gives us words like section, dissection, insect, and even saw. And so that kind of reminds me of back in Genesis when God took woman from man, he cut her away from him. So that's pretty interesting. And so people and most animals and many plants reproduce sexually. In humans, the gametes, which are the ova and the sperm, each have 23 chromosomes, but you need 46 to make a new human being. So the males get half and the females get the other half, and God designed these two gametes to come together to produce offspring. And so Genesis 2:24 says, quote, "Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh." So God did separate men and women, but he still created a mechanism for them to come back together to become one.
Oh, and there's an interesting word right there that I've always wondered about, because the word cleave, so you know what a cleaver is, right? Yeah. You chop something with a cleaver. So cleave implies to separate, but in the text it also implies to join together, which is just really sophisticated, interesting little word.
Yeah.
That I've always wondered about. We'll look further into that. In fact, we'll have our crack staff look into that.
Yeah, we'll put a little note on what we find over at rsr.org for interested audience members.
Cleave. Yeah.
So, but let's get back to the show here. So chromosomes, I also want to clarify here, chromosomes are packets of DNA that give an individual his or her specific traits. Usually when I'm talking about people in general, I would say he, but since we're talking about sex specifically, he and her, I decided I will go ahead and use that terminology.
Okay, all right, because you know how I am. I always like to point out that in the English language, the masculine encompasses the feminine in language. So you can say he, and that can mean he and she and everybody.
Right, and
everybody can be he.
Man, the word man really used to mean human, and then so you would have like a were man is a male man, and a whiff man would have been like a woman. So like werewolf, you know that term, was distinguishes males, and then whiff was woman or wife. But anyway, that's enough etymology. I'm going to ramble on, and we'll never finish.
That's right. We're supposed to be getting into biology.
Right. So And so going back to biology, I don't know if you remember, but when we went to Texas and we did some man on the street interviews, and we came across this one woman who told me that all babies start off as females. And
That's right, at the Fort Worth Art Show. Let's roll that clip.
So you believe in science, right?
oh yeah, I believe in science.
Okay. So, we're all female when we're first created.
Well, we're not really all female. We're just kind of, it's really neither. So you see what she said there, and I kind of tried to correct her, but I told her that we really start off as neither, and that is incorrect also, because as soon as the sperm and the egg unite, in that moment of conception, a human being has all the information to be a male or a female. So it's at conception, your sex is determined.
Oh.
But
That's what I always thought.
right, and so what she was getting confused with is the physical development inside of the embryo. So whether you have the XX, the female, or the XY male chromosomes, the embryo around 7 to 8 weeks post-fertilization will develop 2 pairs of ducts. And I have a graphic up here showing that for our video audience. We have the Wolffian ducts and the Muellerin ducts. So reading from the NIH, it says that these ducts at first, both pairs of ducts are indifferent. But then if you have the XX chromosome, so if you're a female, the Muellerin ducts form the fallopian tubes, uterus, and superior portion of the vagina. In chromosomal males, the Muellerin ducts typically regress under the influence of testes-derived Muellerin inhibiting substance, also known as the anti-Muellerin hormone. So if you are a male, you will produce hormones that will tell these Muellerin ducts to go away. And if you're a female, then you don't have that hormone, so your Muellerin ducts will continue to develop into the full female reproductive organ. And so going back to the NIH article, it says, in males, the Wolffian ducts are critical to the formation of the male internal genitalia and produce the epididymis, vas deferens, and seminal vesicle. The male differentiation of the Wolffian ducts is mediated by testes-derived androgens. In females, the Wolffian ducts regress. So basically what that means is depending on which chromosomes you have, your body will know which hormones to produce, and these hormones will dictate which one of these ducts will continue in development and which ones will regress. And so the intersex, so that would be on a normal development pathway. And so in an intersex person, something goes wrong in the chromosomes, whether you have an extra copy or, a deletion of something. And so you're not having the proper hormone production. And so you have incompletely developed ducts. And this can cause problems for a person in the future.
I see. And so for our friend in Fort Worth, it's not that we all start out as female, it's that we all start out with the capacity to become either one physically.
Right, physically, because the information's already there. Your sex is determined by the chromosome.
That's what I wanted to get at, but the information that's going to direct that physical development, that pre-exists the physical conditions.
Right.
Those express later. Hence, God could say to the prophet Jeremiah, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. So he was there before there was any physical form. There was already the information
That's right.
about who he was, whether he was a boy or a girl. And then there's a physical manifestation that occurs.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So
So at the moment of conception, even before he made it into the womb, God could see the genetic information and he could see what traits Jeremiah would have had, which is really cool. So, but that's pretty much it when explaining what is sex. It's, like I said, pretty short. And so that gets us into when and why did the words sex and gender, when did that start to get blurred? And so I just grabbed the first article that popped up, which of course was Wikipedia. So the sex-gender distinction in Wikipedia, the 2024 article, it's this long multi-page article, and I'm just going to read a part of it. It says, though sex and gender have been used interchangeably at least as early as the 14th century, the usage was not common by the late 1900s. And it goes on to discuss certain psychologists who they call sexologists, like John Money. And sexologist is just I don't know, I guess a scholarly term for deranged pervert. And, you know, anyone with,
Yes.
anyone with the title of sexologist should be kept far away from children and your family. You don't even want to touch them with
Any
a
normal
6-foot pole,
people.
you know. So
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
played a huge part in blurring the lines here and started using this terminology. So it was this long article. So out of curiosity in Wikipedia, I went to the earliest entry for the sex-gender distinction, and it comes to 2006 article, and it's just one short paragraph, and I'm just going to read it for you. It says, "The sex-gender distinction is a concept in feminist theory and politics which distinguishes the sex of a subject from his or her gender. In this distinction, sex is cast as the natural or biological feature of the subject in contrast to gender as the cultural and learned significance of sex. It is strategically important to some strands of political and academic feminism because on it is premised the important argument that gender is not biological destiny and that the oppression of women and dominance of patriarchy do not necessarily follow from biological sexual difference." And then there's one more sentence, but it's kind of clunky. I have a picture of this article posted up on the video for you to read. But basically, the third wave feminists were arguing that sex and gender are both cultural constructs and they're not like a universal truth. But that's the whole article. It's one paragraph because at the time, back in 2006, nobody really cared except a bunch of feminists in college.
Ah, right. Hey, and that's more evidence of as we move down the road of devolution, the further we get from the Garden of Eden and the closer we get to the Book of Revelation, the more words there are involved in describing almost everything,
Right.
at least everything that's corrupt.
And you know, something you've always said was that you know, the more words you use tends to indicate that someone is lying. So a liar tends to use more words. And so just looking at this
This is
article,
true.
starting off with one paragraph and then going into a multi-page, multi-layered, it's just kind of, it's a red flag. And so the feminists and the sexual revolution, I did a show with that with Scott Shamblin back when we covered for Dominic earlier this year. So we'll link to that below. We go through the history of feminism, and basically we've kind of going full circle back into paganism and divination and witchcraft and stuff. It's all crazy. So check out that show. But then I guess now the question is, why are people so confused about their sex? Not necessarily just the distinction between gender and sex, but people who actually don't know if they're men or women. And
Yeah.
I think the number one reason is because a bunch of perverts have taken over the school system. So that gives us reason number 1,000, whereabouts?
1,364.
1,364 to get or keep your kids out of the public school system because they will be influenced by this ideology, and it's very destructive. And, you know, while every person has his own will and is accountable for his own choices, we are influenced by the people and the media, the entertainment that we surround ourselves with. And so it's very important, not just for the kids in school, but also adults, you know, be careful who you surround yourself with. And this was actually shown in an experiment in the 1950s. Social psychologist Solomon Asch, he had this, he had a really cool experiment where he had 7 actors, 7 fake participants, and 1 real participant in his experiment. And so he drew 3 lines over here on the chart, and then he'd give his participants a card with another line. And he just asked them, I want you to match this card to the correct line, the same length line that I drew on the chart. And so for the first few rounds of this experiment, everybody would, you know, his actors would go and they'd put the card on the correct answer. And then he'd see what his real participant would do, and he would pretty much do the same thing. But then over time, he would have his actors purposefully put the card, match it to the incorrect line on the chart. And after doing this a couple times, the real participant was looking around and, you know, he's like, well, that's wrong. It's obviously wrong, but everybody's doing that, so I guess I'll do it too. And he would put his card under the wrong answer. And so after doing this several times, he found that on average, reading from this article I've got. He said, on average, about 1/3 of participants who were placed in this situation went along and conformed with the clearly incorrect majority on the critical trials.
Wow.
And then further, over the 12 critical trials, about 75% of participants conformed at least once, and only 25% never conformed.
Oh, wow.
So that just shows you how easily swayed we tend to be.
And that was in the 1950s.
Yep. And then he also had a control group.
That was, wow.
He had a control group where there were no fakes. They were just everybody who, wasn't in on the joke, I guess. He got less than 1% error, and I think, that's just accident or people who didn't have good eyesight, maybe they needed glasses, but that's just typical.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, so about 1/3 of people generally are swayed by this. And so everybody likes to look to the psychologists who have the big experiment showing all this, but the Bible's been warning us of this exact situation for 2,000 years or more. In fact, in Exodus 23, God literally says, quote, "Thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil," unquote.
Yes, that's 3,500 years ago.
There you go. And then in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 11, Paul writes, quote, "But now I have written unto you not to keep company, if any man that is called a brother be a fornicator, or covetous, or an idolater, or a railer, or a drunkard, or an extortioner. With such a one do not eat," unquote. So there's Paul's warning, don't keep company with these type of people because they're going to impact you. And furthermore, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 33, he says, quote, "Be not deceived, evil communications corrupt good manners," unquote.
Yeah, amen. That's true. Thank you to the Apostle Paul. Wow.
Yep, and so...
Good, solid research there, Nicole. That's why you're a research associate here at the Real Science Radio, because you know where to go to get the best quality research.
I hope so, and we have the brightest audience, so like I said earlier, if anybody in the audience would like to make any corrections, any errors that I've made, please let me know, because we want to get the good information out there, and we will post any corrections in our show notes at kgov@rsr.org.
Yes, and we will also link to Bob Enyart's interview with Wayne Besson documenting this topic. Bob was one of the people standing on the rooftops warning about this even before G. Gordon Liddy. And Bob was warning everyone from a biblical perspective.
Yep.
And so we'll link to that interview as well.
Right.
And so there you have it. Why are people so confused about their sex? Because we live in a fallen world, and there are people who derive self-esteem out of defiling and corrupting other people, and it's because they're wicked and they're evil, and they all need the gospel. The evil people who are trying to corrupt the innocent, they need the gospel. More importantly, the innocent need the gospel, especially while they're young. You can insulate your child from the possibility that they could ever become confused about their sex by teaching them who they are in Jesus Christ when they're a little kid.
Yes.
And keeping them out of the government schools.
Amen. And I think that goes right back to Paul's warning, be not deceived, evil communications corrupt good manners. If you teach your kids the Bible from the time they're very little, they will be able to recognize what evil communications are and know to stay away from them so that they will not be deceived by the evil forces that are out there.
Amen. So get your kids into the Bible early, and then have them tune into Real Science Radio when they get a little bit older and they can deal with topics like this, which I don't recommend necessarily for kids, but it's something, unfortunately, that has to be discussed. And we appreciate you coming on this week to help us investigate and sort through and help people better understand this topic. Nicole, thanks.
Yes, well, thank you for having me on. It's been a lot of fun, and I hope to come back again soon.
Yes, yes. Oh, I'm sure we'll invite you back. For Real Science Radio, and for Nicole McBurney, and for Fred Williams, I'm Doug McBurney. This has been Real Science Radio, is what I wanted to say. May God bless you.